if we want to analytically read, I mean critically, analytically read a poem, a short story, a novel, or a drama, we could do it better if we know the basic elements, if you know and apply the basic elements to understand a poem, drama, novel, or a short story. In this video, let's discuss the basic narrative elements. When I say basic narrative elements, I mean the basic elements of short story and basic elements of novel. But in this discussion, let's be more focused. So instead of discussing the basic elements of fiction, I mean novels, I will discuss the basic elements in short story. I will do it while having examples from specifically 3 short stories. One is Premchand's Thakur's Well. Another is Guy de Maupassant's Necklace, and the other is Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. But I will not analytically explain, describe, or discuss those 3 short stories. Instead, my purpose is to discuss or describe the basic elements, identify, to enable you, to help you, to encourage you to identify the basic elements and try to apply them when reading short stories. The first basic element that I chose for to initiate our discussion is subject matter. So first we need to understand what subject matter means. It's like a raw material. If the short story is the production, subject matter is its raw material. Now what I mean here is, now let's take another approach to understand what subject matter is. We could use, okay, it's like this. Now let's use an example. Now take for an example Sophocles' King Oedipus. So you know that King Oedipus, Sophoclean Oedipus, King Oedipus is a play. It's a drama. That's the genre in literature. When composing this drama, we know that he used Oedipus' legend. In other words, there was a legend was available for him. The subject matter was available for him to use for his drama. So it's the subject matter. Then the next one. So once we understand, try to understand, I think we can understand this better in comparison and contrast to the theme. So what does it mean by theme then? Theme is the interpretation. Now suppose Sophocles used that Oedipus legend, that myth, as a subject matter to compose the drama King Oedipus. So what we mean by theme in King Oedipus is the interpretation or interpretations that Sophocles gives to the subject matter. He uses the Oedipus legend as a subject matter, and then he gives a kind of interpretation to it. In other words, now let's say we are going to write a poem. Okay, let's say, so we are going to write a poem using the same subject matter, okay, something that we experience, something that we saw on our way. But our interpretations would be different. Our interpretations, our interpretations would not be the same. It would be different. It would differ based on our own identities, our own training, our own education, our own political ideologies, our own life philosophies, our own politics, our own class background, our caste, class, culture, cultural, socio-political backgrounds. So depending on our identities, our interpretation differs. Right. The next thing then, the one thing is subject matter. I think that I assume that you understand what subject matter means, and then what themes, the messages mean here. And then the next one. So these are the first two basic elements, subject matter and theme. These two basic elements are related with or closely related to meaning. When you discuss subject matter and the themes, what we mean is the meaning of the short story, not how or the techniques a writer may use to convey the meaning. As the next thing, let's discuss this how part in the sense, the technical part, the technical aspect, how this meaning is conveyed, what kind of techniques a writer may use to convey this meaning, this theme. That's what we mean by the technical aspect. Okay, so as the first thing, let's discuss form. Form is one of the techniques that a writer may use to convey this meaning or his message. So then what does it mean by form? Now I usually use an analog to understand form, or to help others, to those enthusiasts, those students to understand form. The analog that I would use is a dress code, some kind of dress that we use. It could be a shirt, it could be some other. These are things available. So okay, now let's say for an example poetry. In poetry, you know that there are different forms. Now lyric is a form, sonnet is another form, ode, ODE, is another form, satire is another form, narrative poem, narrative poetry is another form. So there are, you know that there are different forms. So they are just like dress codes, different dresses. Now, based on your purpose of the journey, your purpose of going to a place, you have different suitable dress codes. If your purpose is to, okay, now let's say you are going to a wedding and there is a particular dress code for that. Suppose you are going to a classroom, so there's a different dress code. Suppose you are going to a religious place. So when you are going to a religious place, you may not wear the dress code that you use when you are going to a wedding. So you choose a suitable dress code. So likewise, based on our meaning, the meaning that you want to convey, our message, the message that we want to convey, we have different dress codes, different forms. Even in narratives, we have different forms. So the famous forms are, the tragedy is such a form, the tragic form, and comedies, tragicomedies, and romances, or farce, or prahasana, or satires. There are different such forms. If we can identify the form that the writer has used for his composition, I mean the short story, it's easier for us to understand the meaning. Sometimes it might be difficult for us to understand the meaning, the message. If we find it difficult, by analytically identifying the form, we can guess the meaning. Or in other words, our identification, our understanding of the form enables us to understand the theme. Okay, now I usually like to take examples from poetry. Now let's say a sonnet, Shakespearean sonnet or whatever it is, right? Now, usually sonnets are very complex forms. It's not easy to understand the meaning, the message. But if we know, if you have a clear, some sort of an idea about the form, the sonnet, then we can, using that, our identification, our understanding the form, we can guess the meaning of the poem. Now, sonnets were traditionally used to discuss male-female love. That was a tradition. The tradition later on changed. It all the time, tradition changes. Because new writers, based on their own new understanding, exposure to the world, they challenge the tradition. They challenge the tradition. So tradition, it means all the time it changes. However, we know that sonnet was traditionally used to discuss love, I mean generally about love. It changes, but still it may keep some of its early characteristics. So if you know that sonnet was traditionally used to discuss love, sometimes we can, using this understanding, we may be able to guess the message of the poem. Whether it is male-female love, whether it is worshippers' love towards the god or a religious leader. So that love aspect could still remain there. So we could play this guessing game if we have some sort of a clear understanding, if you know the tradition, what form it is. So it means form helps one to understand the theme again. So that is why we say that these two are related with meaning, closely connected to meaning, and here we discuss how this meaning is conveyed. Then form is some kind of a technical aspect which is used to convey the theme more effectively, more appropriate. So in order to convey the meaning more appropriately, a writer may choose a suitable form. If the writer wants to convey the tragic aspect of life, the writer may use the tragic form. Right. The next one, let's select setting as the next basic elements of narratives. Setting, what we mean by setting is the place and the time, when and where the characters, the writer locates the character. When you say place, it doesn't simply mean the geographical place, the location, the geographical place or the landscape. It also means the socio-political, cultural background. So when we say setting, we need to understand these two things. Where the things are located, where the characters are located, that specific landscape. In addition, the socio-political, cultural background. We'll have to attend to both these entities, these elements. The next thing is time. Whether it is set in, let's say, an urban city, urban place, for an example, in Colombo or in Toronto, an exact landscape, exact place. Maybe it is located, the time that the writer refers to could be 17th century, It could be 5th century BC. It could be perhaps today. So we need to understand the time as well, because now suppose in a particular short story, the time is set in 17th century, 18th century France. Without referring to that time, without considering the time, we cannot understand the meaning. We may understand some sort of meaning, but we cannot do some sort of justice to the writer, because writer refers to the problems in his time. So without knowing that time, without attending to that time in which the things, the problems, the characters are represented or portrayed, presented, we cannot do some sort of a justice to that presentation. If we discuss that problem, if we analyze the story, there are problems based on our own problems, the present day problems. We may not be able to do some sort of a justice. Okay, so that is setting. In order to understand then a narrative, we need to understand the setting. The next one, narrative perspective. What we mean by, here we have to discuss two things. One thing is what we mean by narrative perspective, why it is important for the reader. Why it is important for the reader to understand the narrative perspective. Now, traditionally we say that the writers use first-person narrative perspectives or third-person narrative perspectives. These two are familiar to us. These are the ones that we are familiar with. First-person narrative perspective, and then third-person narrative perspective. In Sinhalese, we call it the first one, Uttama Purusha Drushtikoneya, Prathama Purusha, third person, or Prathama Purusha Drushtikoneya. Sometimes, whether it is first-person perspective, whether it is third-person perspective, the narrator's understanding of the problems and the other characters sometimes could be limited. He may not understanding more about the characters, more about the place, more about the cultural background, more about the political background. The narrator may have a limited perspective, limited understanding of the people and the place, its culture, its politics. Sometimes they may have, we usually say, limited and then extended. Some sort of extended understanding, better understanding. Traditionally, we use this word omnipotent. I don't quite agree with using this one omnipotent, because it is not easy to get this omnipotent understanding of something. ඒ කියන්නේ යම් සිද්ධියක් ගැන යම් පුජ්‍යලයක් ගැන සම්පූර්ණ අදහසක් අපට ගන්න පුළුවන්ද කියන එක ඒක එහෙම අය අපට හම්බෙලා නැහැ. We have not met such people who can understand everything about particular socio-cultural place or a person. It's really difficult. I can use an example here. Now let's take for an example the village in the jungle. Our erudite scholarly critics, including, let's use a name here, even Professor D.C.E. Gunatilaka, they highly appreciate, they highly adore this writer, Leonard Woolf, for realistically representing the village life, understanding those villages, their problems, their ethics, their behavior, their desires. Can we believe what they say, what those critics say? We cannot, because Woolf lived in Sri Lanka maybe 5 to 6 years time. The problem is whether he can understand, and he lived even in Sri Lanka in a particular set of people, let's say white people mostly, while associating those, a set of people mostly white educated people, can he understand those village people, their culture, their desires, their expectations, their cult? Can he understand? Sometimes he might have understood those things from a different person. He might have got, third-hand sources to understand those people. So it is really difficult for him to, it is really difficult for us to see this omnipotent understanding. So that's why I would agree with this extended form, extended understanding, but not this omnipotent understanding. Okay, the next one, this narrator could be an insider. In Village in the Jungle, we know that he's not an insider. Since he's not an insider, when I say insider, he's not, he doesn't represent that culture. He's not one of the villagers. That's what I mean by insider. So does he have this insider's understanding of the other people? If he uses here, let's say Wolf used Silindu as the narrator, if he presents the story from Silindu's perspective, using Silindu as the narrator, sometimes he could hide his own identity. It means Wolf could hide his own limited, understanding with identity with limited understanding by using Silindu as the narrator. But here he used a third person perspective, a different narrator, a hired narrator, in whom he hides his own identity. But there, his identity is exposed. It is open. We can see his identity. So does he have this insider identity? That's our problem. Can he develop that insider identity? It's truly difficult by living, for 5 to 6 years. Now, I have lived here for more than now 11 years in this particular place that I'm living now. So do you think that I have this insider identity? Still, I am not being able to develop that identity. Still, I feel that I'm a stranger to this culture. I'm a stranger to this socio-political context. There are lots of things that I'm not aware of, that I have not been able to internalize. So still I feel that I'm not an insider. Still I feel that I'm an outsider. So it is really difficult to develop this insider perspective, right? So sometimes the writer may use or present the story from this insider's perspective, hiring a character from that particular place. Sometimes the writer may be an insider, then it is easier for him to truly represent those people's problems. Okay, so the narrative perspective could be presented from an insider's perspective or an outsider's perspective. Sometimes this narrative perspective could be objective or subjective. Objective in the sense, really, writer may present it without personal biases. It's again something that we cannot agree with, because we being human beings, we bring our own biases into the act of writing. Some people might say that they don't do it, that they can find this objective kind of perspective, but it's again difficult. But we can use, in order to make the narrative more objective, we can use some strategies. Now there's we have a great example for this. So you can use one of the short stories that I promised to get examples from. So one is Hills Like White Elephant. In this short story, in order to make the perspective more objective, Hemingway uses a strategy. So what is it? He uses here the drama technique. Drama technique in the sense, really, he limits the narrative part. He limits narration. Instead, and he presents the story as a dialogue. So we can see a woman and a young man, young woman and a young man sitting at a restaurant, at a railway station, and having a conversation, having a dialogue from the beginning to the end. We listen to this dialogue, and there is limited narration. So limiting the narrative part, narrator's involvement, and enabling, encouraging the two people to be engaged in a conversation, a dialogue, writer helps us to get first-hand experience, first-hand information. The information or their experiences are not presented through a narrator, but we directly listen to them, listen to their conversation, and we decide or we understand what they mean. We interpret what they mean. There is no interpreter. If when the writer uses a narrator, so the narrator interprets, narrator presents it, narrator sometimes describes. So when the narrator describes, that narrator's biases can emerge. So by using such strategies, especially this drama strategy, writers can make a story, make a representation, make a story, make a short story, make that representation more objective. Fairly objective, instead of more objective, I could say fairly objective. So that is one thing that we need to understand when you read a short story. Okay, now let's take for an example, another example from short story to understand this. This is an important aspect. Guy de Maupassant's The Necklace. The Necklace. In Necklace, Maupassant uses third-person perspective. Third-person perspective. Now here, sometimes, sometimes we know that he is a man. It means Maupassant is a man. Now he has to hide his identity in the narrative persona who he hires, whom he uses to tell the story. Tell about, describe, okay, Mathilde, Mathilde's problems, Mathilde's desires, Mathilde and Louise's conflict, her own internal conflict. So the writer uses a narrator. Now let's take for an example, since he uses Mathilde as the central character here, let's say whether he has been able to hide his identity. Now we know one thing that we know about Maupassant is he's a man. His gender identity. We know his gender identity. He's a man. The second one, he's an Englishman, a French. And then, third, he's a Christian. It seems to us when you read the story that he's a very conservative Christian, a conservative man, a traditional Christian. Wouldn't that identity betray through his portrayal? It happens. In this story, it seems to us that it happens. Because he presents Mathilde's desires, Mathilde's characters from his male Christian perspective. Now as a result, what does happen there? Has he been able to present Mathilde's character, Mathilde's problems, Mathilde's desires, doing justice to women? Because here Mathilde is a representative, Mathilde is a type. Mathilde doesn't represent just one person. Mathilde is not an individual. Mathilde is not just one person. She is a type. She represents women, the French women, the French middle class women. So has Maupassant been able to use the narrative perspective, present these middle class women, their desires, their problems realistically, realistically or true to their life, their lifestyle. He has not been able to do it because all the time his Christian male identity seems to intrude, seems to encroach, seems to interfere with the representation. So this is one thing something that we need to pay our special attention to when reading a short story. We have to understand what the perspective that the writer uses is. It is very important. So it's important because it depends on the trustworthiness, whether we can trust what the narrator says, whether we can trust the representation here. Okay, the next one. Okay, now there is something that I missed discussing. That is the impact of writer's identity, because it is closely related with the narrative perspective, and then from this side the interpretation. We discussed that part. The interpretation depends on the writer's identities, writer's socio-cultural identity, writer's political identity, writer's gender identity. We cannot exclude, we cannot be impressionistic. We cannot exclude the piece of writing, the artwork, from the writer's identity. The writer's identity and the artwork interconnected. If we try to isolate we cannot interpret an artwork while isolating it from the writer's identity, because writer brings his own biases. If he were a male, he brings his own male biases. If you're a Christian, he brings his own biases as a Christian. If he's a Buddhist, he brings his own biases as a Buddhist. If he's an old man, he brings his own biases as an old man. If he's a young person, a woman, she brings her own biases. So cultural bias. Now let's say the writer represents the upper class or a working class, and he or she represents a person from the working class or an upper class. His biases, class biases, affect the representation. We could see in that representation his own biases. So for an example, let me use an example from, instead of short story, from poetry. Now let's use Tennyson's poetry. For an example, Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade. Tennyson is a upper class, male, Christian, white person. That is his identity. And he discusses there a war against Russians. Now whose part would he take there? From whose perspective would he interpret the incident? He would definitely interpret from their perspective as a male Christian, upper class white man. So can we trust what he says there? Can we trust what he writes in his representation, how he represents that problem, that incident in Charge of the Light Brigade? So here we need to be very careful, otherwise they can noselead us, they can cheat us, they can deceive us. They can deceive us and they can noselead us to their own ends, their own expectations. This could happen to us, this has happened to us throughout our history, because we know that it is what happens when we read, Woolf's The Village in the Jungle as well. Because we try to analyze the novel forgetting his identity as a writer, forgetting his male, Christian, white, Western identity. We forget his identities. Let's say not identity, but he has lots of different identities. We forget his identities and we exclude the artwork from his identities. We keep it aside. We place it on a pedestal, on a table, on a pedestal, and we appreciate it. We adore it without considering the writer's identity. When we do it, really, we do some sort of unjust to our own expectations, our own identities. Right. So it's really important to understand the writer's identity. And then we need to know whether the writer is an insider, whether he's an outsider. We have to understand his insiderness, outsiderness, the cultural identity, religious identity, his class, his caste, his race, his gender as well. Because all these identities can come into the act of writing, the act of representation. So this is a crucial element. So if we have this analytical understanding of that particular basic element, narrative perspective, it's easier for us to critically analyze, critically understand a short story. It is this understanding that we need to, encourage our students, the short story or poetry enthusiasts to develop. Then they don't need to depend on somebody else's critique, what the others have written, to prove what they write, quoting while referring to those experts. They don't need to, because once they develop, unique identity, this conscious identity, this analytical identity, this analytical understanding, they don't need anyone else's help. They could do it themselves. The next one, mood. I'm not going to touch that part, that one. I'm not going to discuss tone, the writer's tone, and I'm not going to discuss the other narrative techniques. So we could discuss these things some other day, right? Other narrative techniques or plot structure. So let's discuss simply plot structure in our next slide. And then I'm not going to discuss characterization, know the language. I'll briefly now, in the next slide, I will discuss plot structure and form very briefly. So let's select first the form of narratives. So as I told you earlier, there could be tragedies. Tragedy is one form, comedy is another, tragicomedy is another form, farce, we call prahasana, is another form, and then satire is another. So there are different forms. There are lots of other forms. You can write a list of them, right? That's something that we need to do, right? So if you are a teacher, it's better, because in that way you can train your students to become independent readers, independent critics, so that they should not depend on the others, right? So here, once we take let's select tragic form, right? Tragedy as a form. And when we take these three short stories, Thakur's Well, it's a tragedy. It means the writer uses their tragedy as the form for his representation of the Indian outcast people's life, untouchables' life. That's a tragedy. So he uses the tragic form, right? Let's say now his purpose is going to a funeral, right? Present a tragedy. So the suitable dress code for that journey is the tragedy, the tragic dress code. So he wears that tragic dress code. And if we take Hills Like White Elephant, it's again a social tragedy. So the form is tragedy, tragic form. And the next one, Maupassant's one, the necklace, it's again a social tragedy. So he uses this tragic form. Okay, so then in the tradition, this form has fully developed. It began to be developed with Aristotelian analysis in the Poetics. So this is what he says about the tragedy. He says that there's a tragic downfall. If you take for an example the Thakur's well, there's a tragic downfall. Gangi's husband Joku is sick. He's thirsty. They have water at home, but he cannot drink that water because they believe that some animal should have fallen into the well. The water is stinking. He cannot drink that water. If he drinks that water, his sickness could get worsen. So she tries to take water from Thakur's well. She goes to Thakur's well at night to steal some water. But she cannot do it because Thakur's family member in Thakur's family comes out, opens the door, comes out, and then she drops the bucket. She runs home. And when she runs home, she finds Joku being unable to hold that thirst anymore, drinking that stinking water. So now this is a fight against. This is not just a water problem. This is a fight against the outcast people, fighting against those so-called pseudo better caste people. So what has happened here? Can they fight against them? They cannot fight against because they have everything. They have social prestige. The police is with them. The court is with them. The religion is with them. Everything is with them. These poor people, poor outcast people don't have anything. So the realities, the ground realities suggest to us that they cannot fight against. So it's a tragedy. So there's a tragic downfall. Finally, that poor man drinks the same stinking water and she tries to give a fight, but he fails. So that's a failure. That's a downfall. Right. So it ends with a tragedy. It ends with their downfall. So that's one of the characteristics in a tragedy. If you know this form, if you know the characteristic of this form, it's easier for you to understand a narrative, a drama, or a poem without anyone's help. You can analyze it yourself. So this is this critical identity that we need to encourage our students to develop. We can do it not only by, let's say, analyzing the basic elements, describing the basic elements that the writers tend to use when composing those genres: poetry, drama, short story, or novels. There's another tragic change. Okay, I already discussed with you changes from. This is another thing that Aristotle says in his Poetics. Changes. There's some sort of change. In a comedy, there's another type of a change. It changes from misery to happiness. The person, the man, the protagonist, the central character is first miserable. In a comedy, I mean, first miserable. He suffers a lot, but finally he achieves it. It ends happily. So we call it comedy. So it has its own change. From misery, it changes from misery to happiness. In a tragedy, when it comes to a tragedy, there's its own specific change. I mean the traditionally set change, which changes from happiness to misery. So Oedipus changes from happiness to misery. I don't say happiness to misery, there is some sort of happiness. In Thakur's well, it changes from, we cannot say that it changes, traditionally it says that it changes from happiness to misery, but writers change it. Because the ground reality suggests to us that they don't feel ever happy. They cannot feel happy. Their life is all the time miserable. But they try to give a fight and they cannot do it. It ends with their downfall. Whatever it is, there is this tragic downfall. Beginning may not be happy, still miserable, but even the end is miserable. Right. Okay, the next one. So this is the form, so simply, and let's discuss the plot structure. Because now we have already spent 45 minutes. Let's discuss the plot structure. Aristotle, as Aristotle defines in his the Poetics, this is how he defines the plot structure. Plot structure. අපි සිංහලෙන් අපි මේකට කියමු මේ වස්තු කතා සන්දර්භය. This is how he defines the plot structure. It's the logical arrangement of incidents. Now let's take for an example Oedipus, King Oedipus. We know that for this drama, he used available story, the Oedipus legend. So in that legend, you know that there's a story. That story has a beginning, that story has a middle, that story has a conclusion, that story has an end. But in the composition, writer arranges the incident in a different order, in a different logical order, so that they can convey with that order, they can develop their message, some sort of themes. So they do it logically because they have a logical idea. They have an idea to convey. They have a message to convey to the reader. So in order to convey that message, they have to develop that message. In order to develop that message, they arrange the incidents. They logically arrange the incidents. So in King Oedipus, the drama, the beginning is different. It doesn't begin with Oedipus' birth. So when we take the story, Oedipus' birth is the beginning. Middle is becoming the king, and then this famine, the place where he begins to find the killer. End is the place where he blinds himself and live in the city, the banishment. But in the drama, the arrangement of incidents is different. He begins the drama with the midpoint. We call it medias res. So this is what Aristotle means by logical arrangement of incidents. And when we explain it, when we understand it, we can do it by attending to some of the basic constituents of a plot structure. We need to attend to these basic constituents of the plot structure. I don't remember this, I mean Indian way of analyzing, or way of analyzing these constituents. But in English, when we follow Aristotelian poetics, we see these basic plot constituents. The first one is exposition. So what does it mean by exposition? Exposition means the setting. Initially, the writer sets the place. Describe the setting, that's the introduction. Describe the setting. Setting means the place and the time. And then introduce the writer, so as to writer, let's say, introduce the character, the central character. The important characters, especially the central character, the protagonist. And then that particular character's conflict, whether that conflict is an internal one, intrapersonal one, or interpersonal one. Intrapersonal means within their own emotions, their own attitudes, that is intrapersonal. The other is interpersonal, means that person's conflict with somebody else, with the society. Right. So in the very beginning then, the writer introduces to the reader the setting where the things take place, the people, those who get engaged in the incident, and their central problems, the central conflict. So that is what we mean by this logical arrangement of incidents. So when you read a short story, when you read a short story, you don't need to, go on reading to understand the setting, who the central character is, what their central conflict is, where the things takes place, when the things takes place, the time you don't need to go on reading. You can find everything by reading the first paragraph or the second paragraph, because in the first paragraph or in the second paragraph, that's the maximum one. The second, you can find the introduction, because that is the introduction. In the very beginning, the writers usually set the scene. They introduces to you the central characters, the central characters' conflict, where the things take place. That is to, arouse your interest, arouse your suspense, to keep you go on reading. So don't move on, don't go on reading looking for the setting, the central characters elsewhere. Do find it in the first paragraph. You can find it in the first paragraph itself, in a short story. Right. The second one, complication. So better understand this complication. අපි කියන සංකීර්ණ කරණය, සංකීර්ණ කිරීම. What is සංකීර්ණ කරණය? What is what does get complicated here? It's a conflict. The central conflict, we can use a singular term for this, ගැටුම. මේ ප්‍රධාන අපි කියන චරිතයේ ගැටුම. ඒ මම කියන අභ්‍යන්තර ගැටුමක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. තමන්ගේ ඉමෝෂන්ස් අතර තියෙන ගැටුමක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. බාහිර සමාජයත් එක්ක බාහිර පුජ්‍යලයක එක්ක තියෙන ගැටුමක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. මොකක් වුණත් මේක intrapersonal, or whether it is intrapersonal conflict or whether it's an extra or interpersonal conflict, the next thing that the writer may do is to complicate that problem. It's only by complicating the problem, complicating the conflict, that the writer can keep your suspense, keep your interest. Now, for an example, if we take Thakur's well, what is their conflict? We understand Joku, we identify Gangi as the central. I'll take only Gangi's story here because we cannot discuss everything, right? Gangi is the central character. And then where it is set, what is that place? It's a village. In Indian culture, it's a village. What sort of village? In this village, you can find people like Gangis live, outcast people live. In the same village, you can see high caste people like Thakur's live there. So it is an Indian village. So in this village, the society is divided into two caste systems. Let's say especially two castes, the untouchables and then the blue-blooded people or high caste people. So there is this class discrimination. So in this, a society where people have been divided into classes, you can see that, you can predict that one type of people suffer all the time, suffer there. The others, the high caste people exploit the poor outcast people for their own benefit, for their own luxury, for their own comfort. So it means culturally, so there is the divided caste system there, and then the politically, we know that high caste people have the political prestige, they have everything for their favor. The religion stands for their favor. They can use the religion. It is in this story it is said that they gamble 12 months of the year at the priest's place. So it means people like Joku and Gangi, when the life is troublesome, when the life is horrible, when it is tragic, the only place that they go to take refuge, have some help, have some peace, is the Kovil, the temple. But no use of going there, because all the 12 months of the year, those people like Thakur gamble at the priest's place. So they use religion for their favor, in their favor. They use the court in their favor. They use the police in their court in their favor. So in this society, then that is the cultural background. That's the political background. So that's what we mean by setting. So you understand their conflict, how grievous their conflict in such a society. And then, so their problem is, the problem that is presented is, this is a symbolic problem, water problem. This man, Gangi's husband, is sick, is thirsty, and he doesn't have water. There is some sort of water, but he cannot drink that water because it stinks. And this conflict, this water problem, that's the conflict, not having water, fresh water to drink, that's their conflict. The writer then complicates it. Let's see how he complicates this problem. He provides us different options. In order to complicate the problem, he provides different options. Now the first problem, the first option. Now there's a well from which they bring water. I mean, Gangi brings water from that well every day. She's not lazy. She goes 3 times or 2 times or 3 times to the well to bring water. That's what okay, it is from this well that she regularly, every day, brings water from. That is the option that they have, the regular option. But this time, she cannot choose this option because it is said that they assume that an animal should have fallen into the well because water is stinking. Now, can they take water from that well? Now, that is number 1, right? Option number 1. To see how the writer complicates the problem. That's number 1 option. Can she choose this option? No, they cannot. He cannot drink that water because by drinking that water, his sickness could get worsened. Then what else can she do? She has another option. Number 2, option number 2. There is another option. She can boil that water and make it safe for his health. That's a probable one. She can do it. But the problem is she doesn't have that knowledge. She doesn't know it. She's such an illiterate woman is that she doesn't know that by boiling water she can make it safe. Can we believe it? Can we trust what the narrator says here? We can trust because these people are not allowed to get education in such a, society which is divided by the castes, which is divided by the classes. They are not allowed to go to school. They are not allowed to access for education. So their parents had not been allowed to get that education. Their foremothers were not allowed to get that education. So it's probable that she doesn't have that education because if it is transmitted from one generation to the another generation. If one generation were not allowed to get that education, how could they impart that knowledge, transmit that knowledge to the next generation? So she doesn't know that by boiling water, she can make that water safe. Then what does happen? We have to choose another option. So this is how the writer complicates the problem. Number 3 option. The geekeeper has a well in the village. The only other person who has a well is the geekeeper. Geekeeper is a village Mudliya, the Mudalari. So can she take that water from that well? No, she cannot because he takes, let's say 1 rupee for every bucket. So she doesn't have money. Every penny. She doesn't have money. And every time, all the time people are there at the boutique, at that kadeh. People are there, so she cannot steal water from that well. So this is how the writer complicates the problem. He gives us, Premchand gives us different options But this lady, I mean Gangi, cannot choose them. They are not options for her. Okay, there is then another option, Thakus as well. At night, people get into and they sleep because they are idlers. When the night falls, they gamble there and then they go to sleep. So once they sleep, or once they are asleep, she can steal water from that well. This is the only option available now. Now we were given 4 options. Gangi is given 4 options. This is how the writer complicates the problem. And she chooses here the most difficult one. This is the only available one for her, but it's truly difficult. It's a kind of a war. It's a kind of a battle. Okay, so this is how the writer complicates the problem. And then the conflict reaches the climax. It means Gangi goes to the well, Thakus well, to bring the water. And the writer creates a tense situation there. A tense situation where we feel quite afraid. We stand quite afraid whether, okay, what could happen to Gangi at this moment if she gets caught by Thakus people. And Gangi puts the bucket very slowly into the well. And before that, she hides behind the well platform because 3 women come to the well to bring water. And even their conversation, the conversation between the women suggests to us how cruel, how merciless their men are. And an idea is given to us what would happen to, what her fate would be, Gangi's fate would be if she gets caught. And finally, somebody opens the door. That's the climax. Somebody opens the door. Now, an idea is given to us that she cannot steal water. She cannot get water. She drops the bucket, runs home. So that's the climax, end of the climax. In this particular short story, we don't see a gradual resolution. I mean, problem is where the writer gradually, resolve the problem. We cannot see it, but this happens in Maupassant's story. There the climax is losing the necklace, the party followed by the losing the necklace, and then the gradual resolution in that particular story is she spends together with Louisel 10 years. 10 years they work to repay the necklace, to give back the necklace, the borrowed necklace. So there you can see the gradual resolution during these 10 months, or it is enough time for, not Gangi, the particular character is Louisel, Mrs. Louisel, Mathilde. Mathilde has 10 years to understand what her own weaknesses, the mistake that she has done, the folly of her own desires, her expectations. 10 years to understand it. So this is called gradual resolution. In this particular short story, the Thakus well, it suddenly ends with the resolution. The problem is suddenly resolved. She runs home, and when she runs home, she finds her husband Joku drinking that that smelly water, stinking water. So what is the resolution here? Resolution means conflict is there, problem is there, solution is given. Solution is given. What is the problem? The water problem, the caste problem. So what is the resolution? They cannot fight against it. They have to understand, they have to take their own situation as their fate. That is their fate. They cannot change their fate. Their fate to live as outcast people. So that's what they have to acknowledge. Because in such a society where they are like Lilliputians at the foot of the, Gullivers. Thakus are the Gullivers there, and Gangis are the Lilliputians. So here they cannot fight against Gulliver. They cannot fight against them. So they have to accept their own fate. So that is what happened. That's the resolution. They cannot fight against. In such a society, still they cannot fight against. Everything is in their favor, in high caste people's favor. So this is the resolution. So we simply discussed the basic elements. That is something that you need to know. These basic narrative elements in order to get an analytical understanding of short story or novel. So not novel here, specifically short stories. So in order to get this analytical understanding, analytical reading, or to analytical read a short story, a narrative, you need to understand these basic elements. So we discussed these basic elements. Some of the basic elements, this is an initial discussion, and then we briefly discussed two basic elements. One is the form and the other is the plot structure. So this is how a writer develops a plot structure: exposition, complication, it moves on to the climax, the climactic moment, and then the downfall, gradual resolution, and then the resolution. Okay, thank you so much. Have a great day.